Okay, so welcome all to this this week's Gatty. I am Elisa Domingo Badique. I go by E for short. I am one of the SEEP co-chairs, and as you can see, I'm not there in person. But I would like to start with a land acknowledgement to start us off. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So greetings, everyone. My name is Elisa. I just realized I introduced myself already. But we would like to extend our thanks to you all for joining us today, whether in person or virtually. Due to both co-chairs being remote today due to COVID diagnosis and COVID exposure, we are unable to join in person. And my co-chair Nikita is currently recovering and lost her voice. So I will be helming the Zoom sphere and speaking for us both. But fortunately, we have 2 amazing grad students here at SEEP who have generously volunteered to take on the in-person portions on our behalf. And they're amazing. Thank you for coming in clutch, both of you. And I'll let them introduce themselves and they can take it from here.
Hello. I am SEEP Gatty presenter, also known as Bruno. Thank you so much, Ian, for giving me the wonderful opportunity to introduce Professor Fiorella. So for those who are joining us for the first time, the Ronald and Janette Gatty Lecture Series, formerly known as the Brown Bags, is a weekly lecture series held every Thursday at this time during the academic year at the George McTee Kahin Center for Advanced Research on Southeast Asia, eliciting engaged conversations between scholars across all disciplines in Southeast Asian studies. We are happy to enjoy the delicious return of the Gatty tradition with a catered lunch being served alongside the talk today. And with that out of the way, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Kathryn Fiorella, Assistant Professor in the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health here at Cornell University. She leads the Food Systems and Health Concentration area of the Master of Public Health program. She's also a faculty fellow of the Atkinson Center for Sustainable Future and the Center for Health Equity. Dr. Fiorella holds a PhD in Environmental Science, Policy and Management, and a Master's in Public Health from the University of California, Berkeley, and in Arts Baccalaureate from Princeton University in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Dr. Fiorella was an Atkinson Postdoctoral Fellow at Cornell and a Postdoctoral Immersion Fellow at the Socio-Economic Synthesis Center. Dr. Fiorella is an environmental scientist and epidemiologist, and her research aims to understand the interactions among environmental change and livelihood, food and nutrition security. Her work is focused on global fisheries and the households that are reliant on them to access food and income. She uses interdisciplinary methods, and her work aims to foster a deeper understanding of how ecological and social systems interact, the ways that communities and households adapt to and mitigate environmental change, and the links between human well-being and ecological sustainability. Please give a warm round of applause for Professor Fiorella.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. So I'm going to be talking today about environmental change in Cambodia's aquatic food systems. And so for me, this photograph we're starting with here encapsulates the social ecological systems perspective that I take across the projects that I'll be presenting today. And so what that means is trying to understand human impacts on natural resources and the drivers of environmental change, and also closing the loop to think about the feedbacks that from environmental change back to people. And so this perspective is interested in understanding the outcomes of the system for people, for example, livelihoods, well-being, human health. And it's also really interested in the relationships between people and the environment and how they alter the function of each other at different scales. So to do that, we think a lot about the role of people in the system as managers of resources and actors in the fisheries. And at the same time, examine the ecological changes that are taking place and how that's changing those relationships. And so the man pictured here is fishing in the rice field fisheries of inland Cambodia. And in this setting, we'll be asking 3 questions. So how do fishing families value these fisheries and see the changes that are affecting them? What happens to fish catch and fishing effort as temperatures change? And what factors affect biomass and biodiversity in inland protected areas, which are community managed areas designed to improve the biomass and biodiversity and people's livelihoods? And so this is the first question that we'll be tackling today. And it's routed in the ecology of the system, but asking about this management strategy designed to improve fish catch. And so here we're thinking about what is the role of the site characteristics where we place these protected areas in the ecosystem? What is the role of the annual fluctuations that drive a lot of the seasonality in the system and also people's behaviors? What are the roles of management actions that people are taking too? And so before we jump into the real details of that, I wanted to start with a little bit of background about global fisheries to kind of frame this question. So small-scale fisheries provide livelihoods for 100 million people globally and food for about 1 billion people. 90% of those people work in the global south. So small-scale fishers means not that their contribution to global fisheries is small or unimportant, it's not the very best name, but that they're operating smaller vessels, fishing from the shore and part of smaller fishing crews. So in other words, that they're much more likely to look like the fisher in this image than an industrial fishing crew. And in fact, small-scale fishers harvest about 2/3 of all global fish catch. So they're supplying a really predominant quantity of fish that is caught globally. They catch a diverse array of species. So while it includes fish that are sold, their catch also makes a really important contribution to household diets and food security. And as an animal source food, the fish that they're supplying are really particularly important for their nutrient density. So this is protein to some degree, but much more important in a lot of cases are the micronutrients and fatty acids that fish are supplying. And from a nutritional perspective, when we think about the diets, especially of young kids, animal source foods, so foods that are animal foods, because of their nutrient density, often are the linchpin in diet quality. So whether someone has access to these regularly makes a big difference in their growth and development outcomes, and ultimately whether kids will be malnourished. In a lot of settings, it's still a really key determinant. Okay. And so another point to make here is that our global fisheries include, of course, marine fish catch, but also inland fisheries and fishers. And so that's the context that we're going to focus on today. I think a lot of times the supply of fish from inland fisheries isn't necessarily as large, and especially in settings in the US, we don't necessarily recognize the role that they might have in supplying food. But globally, and particularly in Southeast Asia, particularly in Cambodia, they're a really important source of food for incomes and food, and they're a source of food and income. And so in this context where freshwater fisheries are really particularly important, Cambodia is trying this new strategy to bolster fish populations called community fish refuges. And these are essentially inland protected areas that provide an additional habitat for fish to conserve biodiversity, increase fish catch, and utilize community-based management to provide for them. So the system in Cambodia is incredibly biodiverse, more than 500 fish and aquatic animals. And so thinking about ways to bolster the productivity of that system, which relies on this sort of central Tonle Sap Lake mechanism, has been an ongoing project. And I think these are an innovative idea to think about. And so what factors affect the biomass and biodiversity of inland protected areas? It's the key focus of the question we're going to ask here. And we think this is particularly important because it focuses on inland fisheries. It uses really site-specific controls that lets us look year over year at what's affecting these outcomes. And it also uses a new approach to analyzing social ecological systems that lets us look over time at some of these factors. So a little bit more about the system. So the Tonle Sap Lake is pictured in the center here. Oops, sorry. I'll go back. The center of Cambodia, and the community fish refuges are the green dots surrounding it. And so they're located in essentially the floodplain of the lake and really particularly areas adjacent to rice field fisheries. And so the floodplain has this combination of ecosystems, including flooded forests, lakes, tributaries, streams, a whole host of different habitats for fish and people, and increasingly is a major site of rice cultivation in the country as well. So rice fields are really unique in that they allow for both the cultivation of fish and rice, this potential for a dual crop here that can be really beneficial and really widely produced. So Cambodia also has the 5th highest inland fish harvest globally. For a country that's relatively small, this is really striking. An incredibly productive fishery system, the highest per capita inland fish harvest and consumption rates. And so inland fishing households also generally are getting about 50% of their income from fish and 50% of their total animal protein from fish as well. So again, sort of underlining that substantial contribution to diets and livelihoods. And so I'm going to show you, I hope, a video of the flood pulse in the system. Okay, there we go. So you can see it here, and I'll play it a couple times. This is the Mekong River coming down Cambodia. So folks familiar with this region will realize that Cambodia, the last stop on the Mekong River. And this is the Tonle Sap Lake. And annually it floods to about 5 times its size. So a really striking shift in this floodplain that happens on an annual basis and drives a lot of the ecology of the system. So fish are making a migratory journey from within the depths of the lake out into the floodplain in some cases. Other species of fish are living on the floodplain year round and in other more seasonal water bodies. And what happens with this flood pulse on an annual basis has a lot to do with the overarching productivity of the system. So you can imagine in years where there's less rainfall, less water coming down the Mekong. So thinking about the rainfall across the whole watershed and also the dynamics of dams that might be upstream has a really big impact on sort of the volume of water that reaches Cambodia. And then that in turn has a really important consequence for how much fish are produced, because it's essentially the size of their habitat. And so these community fish refuges were implemented by the government of Cambodia as a strategy to try to improve fish catch for people in the floodplains and the productivity of the system. And so I'll explain how they work. So in the dry season, water use is really managed for vegetable irrigation, trying to maintain a sufficient level for good water quality in these systems. And refuges provide habitat that allows for fish populations to grow and sort of make it through the dry season successfully. And fishing in the refuge itself is prohibited. So in this sort of stylized image, it looks like kind of just a plot in the rice field. They're actually incredibly diverse in how they look. So some are really large, many acres, others are relatively small ponds. So a lot of variation in the size, really fit site specifically to what would work in a given setting. In the rainy season, when the flooding happens, the fish from that are in these ponds then flow out into the rice fields where fishers can then catch them. And they also are feeding and spawning in this larger habitat, and that has a lot to do with the production. And then when the floods recede, it sends a signal to the fish to head back to the place where the water is, and they move back into the rice fields, into the community fish refuge in order to make it through the next dry season. And so this is one image of a community fish refuge. So some are much more expansive, larger ponds or even a segment of a lake. And they're integrated into this diverse habitat that of course includes the rice fields, includes connecting channels, rivers, streams, and ponds throughout the landscape too. And so the fish moving between all of these. And so just to underscore the point about the fish that are in this system, they're really amazing. And so the second highest freshwater biodiversity in the world is found in the Mekong region, the second only to the Amazon. And fish are doing a lot of different things. So there are some that are moving all the way from the Tonle Sap out into the floodplain. There are others that are really hardy fish, like I'll show you a video of these guys, climbing perch and snakehead, can essentially walk themselves between water bodies to make it through the dry season. And so this is a little bit of a picture of how these guys might navigate being on a drier climate over a longer period of time. So also, of course, the positioned in this basket just for show. They store them in a much higher vessel to make sure they don't escape quite so easily. So a really amazing and biodiverse system. And so here in this analysis, what we're looking at is 40 community fish refuges over 3 years. And so community fish refuge biomonitoring data was collected every 3 months for 3 years. And the site characteristics were also documented, as well as the activities that the communities managing these refuges were undertaking. And so to make these really effective, modifications were made to the habitat itself. And so these included things like digging larger channels, digging out pieces of the pond to make them larger habitats, and then sort of range to providing signage and guardhouses. And there were also a bunch of governance mechanisms and community engagement that was done to support these refuges and the people that were living in these areas, to really see if people could support them and they were beneficial to the communities where they were sited. And so USAID, so the Ricefield Fisheries Community Fish Refuge were implemented by the government, and USAID funded World Fish, which is an organization based in Penang, Malaysia, with sort of a research and development focus on fisheries and poverty reduction to essentially support a small number of them. And so they started with these 40 and then have since scaled up this project, actually. And so we're analyzing the data that was collected as a part of that sort of bolstered support project. And so again, really pulling together ecological and social dimensions here. Okay. So the research question that we asked was, what affects the biomass and biodiversity in these refuges? And so we took into account the site characteristics. So things like the surface area, so how large and how much habitat an individual reserve was providing. And we also thought that water quality, which is careful data collected about this, was really important. So a lot of the interventions are designed to improve the water quality. So things like improving the inlets and outlets, the channels, because the water quality is ultimately going to have a huge effect on the fish populations in these refuges. We look specifically at the CFR committee activities and their effect both on the water quality and directly on biomass and biodiversity through other mechanisms. So they might affect water quality by removing vegetation or adding vegetation to sort of really measure that. But they might also have a separate effect on biomass and biodiversity by, for example, spending a lot of time with community meetings and making sure that people in the system sort of navigated some of the challenges. So for example, some of these are ponds that are around normally, and they've made some modifications to enhance them. Well, over the dry season, the water in them is very much of interest to the surrounding community members, right? They almost certainly had a use for that before we called it a community fish refuge. So in some cases, there really was a lot of demand on these ponds' water for irrigation, for vegetable crops that are being grown, right? And so in a lot of cases, these were solved actually by creating a separate pond to allow people to really continue irrigation activity. So a lot of negotiation to really try to figure out like what would functionally work for people to be able to keep these fish in the refuge, but still go on with their other activities. And then the other really big dynamic, as you can see from the flood pulse, is the timing, duration, and extent of the flooding season. So I think we all know that climate and temperature and rainfall are changing around the world, certainly also true in this region. And so those big annual fluctuations are pretty well established drivers of the production of the system. And so in a way, these refuges are trying to act in concert with that, but have to grapple with some of those challenges for sure. And so we're looking at these 40 sites over 3 years. And what we find are strong site-specific effects. So the site characteristics had a really big effect on biomass and biodiversity in the refuges. Water quality also had a strong effect on these activities. And so too did the annual fluctuations. So what we see less of actually are the effects of the CFR committee actions. And so this is, I think, a challenging thing to actually try to measure, in part because the things that these committees were doing were really fit to a given site. And so we're trying to aggregate some of the things that they did so that we can measure them. But in reality, the best response a lot of times, I think, to these annual fluctuations and the site-specific characteristics are the latitude that an individual community would have to make the modifications that they actually need in these systems. And so what we found in more qualitative work is that people really felt very positive about the governance of these committees. And that, so despite not sort of seeing these indicators here, that these annual changes are important and each site is unique really underscores this value of a flexible approach to conservation. And one that's situated at a specific site and community-based allowed for faster responses to changing environmental conditions. So one anecdote about that is that in some years, communities felt like the flood from the main Tonle Sap Lake didn't reach them. And so, but they still had fish in their rice fields. And so they saw the really direct connection to the refuge itself. And so could highlight some of those dynamics. So this analysis of community fish refuges underscores that important role of annual fluctuations. And of course, one of the most important drivers of those changes is shifts in our climate. So as we return to the fisher here, we're going to ask an additional question about the role of changing temperature in affecting fish catch and fisher behavior. And so this question is, what happens to fish catch and fishing effort as temperatures change? So there are a lot of decisions that people make in the system. Do they decide to fish at all? Do they fish more or fish less? Do they change the gears that they're using and the places that they're fishing? Do their catches change? And does the catch that they're getting for the same amount of effort, meaning, for the same hours or days spent fishing, do those shift? And so we ask this question because there's been more and more research illuminating the effects of warming temperatures on fisheries. And of course, we know they're likely to have effects throughout our global ecosystems. So this relatively recent article used a mechanistic model to hindcast changes in fisheries yield that have happened between 1930 and 2010 and are specifically linked to temperature. And they examined a whole bunch of different fish stocks, and they found that a handful of them were really negatively influenced by temperature, a couple were positively influenced by warming, but in aggregate, there was this 4% reduction in yield over this period up to 2010. And when folks have looked at models that combine habitat suitability based on temperature conditions and changes in net primary productivity to project what climate change might do in the future, they've also projected really substantial effects on fisheries. And so these findings suggest we're going to see a poleward shift in where the distributions of the commonly exploited fish stocks are, and that will be the result of invasion of warmer water species into the higher latitude regions. And so we'll see people be moving to shift to these fisheries as well. And the greatest effects are projected to be in the tropics, so the regions in dark red. And so in the current situation, about 90% of fish that are being monitored are fished at or above their capacity. So these changes are really meaningful because we're sort of already at the point where we're capturing what we can from our global fisheries. And so these projections suggest that there'll be a 6% reduction in total marine fish catch due to these changing climates, and that will put about 10% of the global population at risk of increasing micronutrient and fatty acid deficiencies because they'll have less access to these fish. So potentially a very worrisome trend. But note here that this is all really focused on marine species. And so freshwater fisheries have the potential to really be quite different for a number of reasons. So first of all, physically, they're in shallower, more hydrologically distinct water bodies. So when we think about one of the main things that people talk about with climate change, that fish will just simply move into different habitats where the water temperature is more suitable, that is far less likely to happen in inland systems. So certainly they do migrate to some extent, within the network of water bodies, but their movement is obviously capped in some ways. It also has a really big effect on water quality. So temperature potentially warming these water bodies more so, increasing evaporation, and also potentially increasing eutrophication of these systems as well. Socially, really big implications here. Human demand for water is obviously extensive, and there are a lot of competing demands for fresh water. So energy for dams, irrigation for crop production, and of course, fresh water for domestic uses. And these are already tend to be really highly altered systems. So pollution, eutrophication, salinization, invasive species are all really common dynamics in freshwater fisheries. And dams and changing flood patterns are considered some of the most immediate threats to freshwater fisheries, especially in the Mekong region. And so here we're going to focus on these overlooked yet important and vulnerable freshwater fisheries. On the small scale fishers operating in the system, a lot of work thinking about climate change impacts is thinking about our industrial fishing fleets. And when we think about the impacts of climate, we're going to try to integrate not only the ecological effects, so we'll see something happen to the fish populations in the water, but also how people respond to those systems, and use observed catch data as opposed to modeled projections. And so there is some evidence that suggests changes in fisher behavior, that people are perceiving climate change in some settings, and the temperature has changed their fishing grounds, the target species that they're going for, but it's pretty limited so far. And there's also evidence of these effects in other contexts. So as we mentioned, in industrial stocks, fishers are already moving northward, and in agriculture, temperature has been seen to alter lots of people's behaviors, increasing input use, for example, in this article. And so fishers also engage in a plurality of livelihoods. I think underlining some of these other points, so the folks in the system, they're not only fishing, they're also farming rice. They're also potentially participating in wage labor. Maybe someone in their household has migrated to a city. So the dynamics that are happening to them aren't isolated to fishing either, right? This is one subset of their livelihood. And so here we're looking at 414 households in inland Cambodia. And so these house data was collected about these households over 19 time points, which for survey data is really a lot, every 2 months over 3 years. And the communities were selected as those around the community fish refuges. So each refuge, so they're sort of pegged to these 40 sites. There are 16 households selected around them, and then from those, 10 were purposely selected to participate in this longer term study. And so to look at this, we use controls for rainfall, flood extent, and month to try to isolate the effect of temperature, and really strong statistical controls that let us look at the same household's behavior over time. And so what that does is it controls for the things about them that may be hard to measure, but are important. So for example, like someone's knowledge of fishing, that's something really tricky to measure, but if we're looking at the same person over time and how temperature changes their behavior, we're comparing them to themselves. So focusing on these small scale fishing households in the freshwater context, we aim to look at the effect of temperature on fish catch. And so we have a couple different pathways we're going to examine. So this includes an ecological pathway, which we don't measure directly, but we try to isolate here, whereby temperature has an ecological effect on fish populations and then on fish catch as well. And a behavioral pathway where temperature affects fishing effort with implications for fish catch. And at the same time, recognizing that the alternative activities that people might be engaged in may also be affected by this too, by temperature as well. And so we're trying to identify the behavioral effect and the ecological effect of temperature on fish catch here, recognizing that temperature change at once affects both parts of the system. So we first look at the effect of temperature directly on dimensions of fishing effort. So the first decision that people make is, are they going to go out fishing at all, right? So over a given period, are they going to be participating in fishing? And then from there, we look at, if they go fishing, how much time do they spend? And what is their gear choice? And so we divided the gears into a set of passive gears. So these are things like traps or a line for fishing that you might set. in the morning, come back to in the evening, set in the evening, come back to in the morning, what have you. There's an amazing array of gears that people use, really diverse, from things that you might stick in a channel to larger traps that would fit really specifically into the habitat that you're fishing in. But the idea being essentially that these passive gears require less like ongoing investment, right? Like you still have to go out and set it, but you don't have to spend all day doing that. So if conditions weren't great, maybe you would go ahead and do this even though you weren't expecting as big a return. In contrast, activities that we're calling active fishing gears. And so these are things where you're like really actively throwing out a net, raking. These are eel rakes that people are using to collect, a basket to scoop, going through a water body, pulling a net, a different kind of activity than sort of something you set and return to. And the diversity of gears that people use is I think really amazing and in parallel very much to the diversity of fish and aquatic animals in the ecosystem that they're harvesting too. And so then we next look at the effect of temperature directly on fish catch itself. And so this is essentially combining the ecological effects and the behavioral effects into one pathway here. And this is typically actually also the outcome that people are using when they're thinking about what is the effect of temperature on fish. And finally, we also look at fish catch while holding effort constant. And so what that lets us do is isolate this ecological effect of temperature on fish catch. And so by comparing the effect of temperature with and without the effort controls, we can see the ways that considering that behavioral pathway influences the outcome that we might find. And so these graphs show the combined effects of temperature over the last 2 months on fishing participation. And so the value at a given temperature represents when the average temperature is 1 degree higher over the last 2 months. So intuitively, that sounds like a pretty small amount, I think, in terms of a sustained change, but it's actually really quite in line with what the climate change projections in this region suggest. So they're suggesting between 1.5 to 2.5 degrees of warming. And so again, we're holding rainfall, flood extent, and month controls in here. So we're really isolating that temperature effect. And so the current mean temperature is 28 degrees Celsius. And so a temperature change from 28 degrees Celsius to 29 degrees Celsius has the effect of reducing fishing participation by 6%. A temperature change from 29 to 30 degrees Celsius, so starting at this higher point, has the effect of reducing fishing participation by 8%. And these are additive. So with a 1 to 2 degree rise above 28 degrees Celsius, we find a 6 to 14% less likely that people are fishing. Among those who do choose to fish, we find a lower time spent fishing, but this relationship isn't statistically significant. And similarly, among people who are fishing, we find a higher probability of active gear use, but the relationship again isn't statistically significant. So when we examine this behavioral pathway, what we're really seeing is a reduction in people fishing, but among those who are fishing, no significant effects on the time that they're spending or their gear choices. And so we next looked at the implications for fish catch. And so first, we directly estimated the effect of temperature on fish catch and found a negative but statistically insignificant relationship. So this is without the specific consideration of these two pathways. And so then we added in our controls for catch per unit. We added in our controls for the human dimensions, essentially, whether people are fishing, the time they're spending fishing, and their gear choice, to isolate this ecological pathway from the behavioral pathway. And this gives us what we're calling a measure of catch per unit effort. So it's essentially how much are you catching for the time and effort you put in. And so what we find here is that a temperature change from 28 to 29 degrees has the effect of increasing fish catch per unit effort, which is a good thing for fishers generally, by 13%. And a temperature change from 29 to 30 degrees has the effect of increasing catch per unit effort by 17%. So in summary, we're finding that as temperatures warm, people are less likely to go fishing, but when they do go fishing, the returns on their effort are higher, likely driven by warming having increased the productivity of these systems. And so that's something we see in a lot of settings that, you do see crops grow faster, you do see phytoplankton production being higher. And so these are actually having potentially positive effects on fishery productivity. But these changes also counterbalance each other. So there is no net effect on fish catch. And so this actually holds true for the harvest of aquatic plants and aquatic animals in this system too. And so we suspect what is happening here is that warming temperatures are also affecting households' livelihoods outside of fishing. So many consider rice farming a primary occupation. There's been a lot of evidence that warming temperatures, for example, increase weed pressure in agricultural systems. So we don't know specifically what's happening here, but a strong suggestion that this pathway is pulling folks away from fishing, even when their returns are pretty good. And so our findings here highlight the importance of including this behavioral pathway to really understand what are the functional effects of climate change for households. So failure to account for these behavioral dimensions could have really different implications for how we understand that climate change impacts. And so, especially given the complexity of people's livelihoods, it could threaten to misdirect some of the response that we might need to households who are harvesting resources. And so, underlining this point that ultimately, understanding the effects of climate change is going to hinge on accurately predicting and integrating both what's going on with human behavior and ecology of these systems. Okay, so the findings I've shown you so far come from ecological and survey data, which is a major method I use in my research, but it's also, of course, critical to understand the perspective of people who are using these systems. And to have their voice represented in the science that comes out of them. And so with that in mind, we really wanted to ask, how do fishing families value these fisheries and see the changes that are affecting them? So what do people value about the fishery? What challenges does the fishery face? And how do perceptions differ between men and women and across different communities? And so this diversity of the system here, with more than 500 fish species, seasonality of production, range of aquatic animals that people are also really reliant on, really has the potential to have an array of things going on at once. And so we really wanted to understand better, what changes do people observe across all these dimensions? What's important to them? And so to better understand these dynamics, I worked with the Center for Khmer Studies and students here at Cornell on a Photovoice project. And so I'll just tell you a little bit about this method first. So Photovoice is a participatory qualitative research method, and it involves participants taking photographs based on a prompt. And so the one we used here was, what is the story of fish diversity in your life? And then participants received training about the process of taking photographs, covering a range of content from ethics to composition. Then they go and take photographs. We give them cameras for a stretch of time. In our case, they had 5 to 6 days, including some weekdays and some weekends, to take a set of photographs. And then with an interviewer, they select photographs that they want to talk more about. And then we go through a brief interview with them, asking essentially what's in the photograph and what's behind the photograph. So people talk about the thing that they selected, and then also what the meanings of that situation were for them. And then, oops, sorry about that. Then they come together as a group in a focus group and share their photographs with each other and reflect further on this. And at its root, the goal of this method is to provide for both individual empowerment and for the community to have some tools to understand the community challenges and assets and what's going on. And so I think the method was really fun to do with people. I think people really enjoyed the photo process. It was a new one for me to use. And I think there are some challenges into really imagining it as an action method and sort of getting all the way down these lines that I'd be happy to talk further about too. And so we did this with 4 communities, 2 within rice field fisheries and 2 that were right adjacent to the Tonle Sap Lake. And when available, men and women in the same household were both invited to participate. So everyone had their own separate camera. And so we wound up with 21 households and 36 people, 20 men and 16 women who participated. And so these are some of the photographs that folks took. And I think one of the really initial takeaways for us and the photos generated from this project has really been the richness of the biodiversity people are using in their daily lives. So this relates very much to culinary traditions, links back to the different segments of the ecosystem people are harvesting these foods from. And you can see a whole range of fish species here. So a whole bunch of different types of fish, mollusks, crabs, and more. And so I wanted to share a few examples of what participants said about these photographs that they had taken. So the participant that took this photograph here said, "It represents our good health. We have energy. Fish have good vitamins. I feel happy when I get fish to cook as food for our everyday life." And a participant who took this photograph said, "The biodiversity surrounding my community provides me enough variety of fish to support our livelihood. Therefore, we don't have to buy food from outside sources." And so I think these representations underscored a lot of the pride that people felt in their livelihoods, and that the food that they were getting from them was nutritious and really of value to their families. That notwithstanding, people also highlighted a whole lot of challenges and some solutions for what they were also facing in these fisheries. So I'll share a bunch more photos and quotes from folks. So this photograph, which I think is really a beautiful photograph, when the participant looks at it, what she said was, "We caught only a small quantity of fish. I am upset when I think about making a living from this. The fish that I caught don't even fill up the container. It only filled up the bottom of the container." And so I think underscoring her reflections on sort of what is behind this, when she looks at this photograph, she's thinking about the challenges that she's facing in her livelihood. And this participant said, "It's difficult for me to think about what kind of food to make when the fish is so little, because we live close to the lake and we used to eat bigger fish. Now that we got only a small quantity of fish and we had to sell some to earn money, it was very difficult. If we don't buy vegetables to cook with the fish, the food won't be enough." And so really highlighting these challenges and the really direct impacts of fish scarcity on food security, well-being for the household. And I think the other thing that really arose from this had a lot to do with some of the place-based specifics too. So this woman lived in a community that was right adjacent to the Tonle Sap Lake. And that was a place where we heard from people a lot more sort of depth of challenges in trying to figure out how to make their way without many alternatives provided. In contrast, so someone who lived in the rice field fisheries, we gave this prompt about fishing. He took this photograph and he said, "I love this picture because this year I grew a good amount of rice. I didn't catch anything because the water level in the rice fields is too low after I harvested the rice." And so really turning directly to this activity that is providing a more sustainable income at the moment. And a bunch of folks actually highlighted non-fishing activities, especially the people living in the rice field fisheries, that when they think about fishing, they think about the alternative that they're doing instead. And so this was lotus flower harvesting, rearing chickens, a whole host of different activities. And so it really underscored that a lot of their opportunities in the future they saw in other arenas. Folks in the rice field fisheries also felt relatively positive about the conservation action, saying, "I want conservation for fishing from the government because this year fish population is less than other past year." And so these representations of rich biodiversity amid a whole bunch of challenges have led to a set of key themes that emerged for us. So people really highlighting the foods that they felt were important to them culturally and they really valued, this rich diversity visually too, but also really underscoring again and again the challenges that they faced, and especially the place-based ones. So for communities right next to the Tonle Sap Lake, the flood there meant that roads were impassable during stretches of time. They had a lot less access to other things during that stretch of time, and they were really feeling a lot of challenges because of that. Declining fish catch came up again and again. Seasonality, illegal fishing was a really interesting topic, and I'll share a quote about that as well. And it really sort of underscored this conflict that's happening between industrial and small scale fishing, or industrial also sort of representing fishing with larger gears by outsiders perceived in one way or another. Not an illegal, not really having necessarily an underpinning at the rules, so much as what people felt like was going to be destructive to the fishery. And so I think this quote encapsulates some of this. And he said, I want the government to make sure there is no illegal fishing because we have a reduction of fish. Because they use big equipment to fish, that's why we don't catch a lot of fish. My net is laid in one place. Their net is used to chase the fish all the time. I'm afraid it can never get better. If the government is really good, they will find a way to prohibit the use of bigger equipment for fishing. And so I think a lot of folks in the system really felt like we're doing things that are more sustainable by definition because we're doing it at a scale that's totally different from these industrial or outside or illegal fishing operations. And so that tension was really clear as well throughout. And so we've looked at a few different analyses of these interactions between people and aquatic food systems in Cambodia. And folks who live and work in these systems both have this tremendous richness of biodiversity and resources, and they face a lot of challenges in navigating their management and development and really external changes to them that they may not have a lot of direct control over, whether they're about climate or about who has rights to fish in this lake or about the damming of the Mekong region. And so really critical across the board is trying to think about understanding these systems and the change that happens within them in tandem with the social systems in which they're intimately interacting. And so hopefully the community fish refuge project that we talked about initially also provides sort of an optimistic or hopeful look to think about ways that some of these challenges can be addressed for folks and at least sort of the creative lens to thinking about strategies that might both deal with these environmental changes and people's need to make a sustainable but also meaningful livelihood and income that really supports them. And so with that, I'm really happy to take your questions and thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Professor Fiorella. So now we'll move on to the question and answer portion. So because we're in a hybrid sort of format, we'll switch between in-person questions and questions over Zoom.
Look forward to not having material. Just help us look back a little bit.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So sort of about the historical institutions in the system that certainly predated the community fish refuges and broadly. So this is a great question and certainly a really complex set of factors that historically underpin the current context. And so I can talk a little bit about where to start actually. In the period of the Khmer Rouge, fisheries were actually sort of described as flourishing, right? So everyone was pushed out of cities into relatively rural areas. There's a genocide, a really terrible situation, but the focus was also really on rice farming. And so during that period of time, the fish stocks were thought to have relatively recovered actually. And so if we sort of take it from this period of time, there's a fish stock in the lake and in the Tonle Sap Lake and also the surrounding regions that's considered to be pretty robust. Also a population that's suffering really tremendously. And so during that period of time, as things sort of shifted away from that period of really intense conflict, the population was also relatively more rural. And so that trend towards urbanization, Cambodia has certainly shifted, but the population is also still, the density of the population in rural areas is still relatively high. So we still have a lot of people depending on these resources and using them really actively. So in that period of time after the height of the Khmer Rouge rule, there were a lot of changes in who was allowed to fish and the concessions granted, especially internationally. And so for periods of time, there was a fair amount of Vietnamese fishing in the Tonle Sap Lake. At other points in time, it was completely outlawed. And so there are some shifts back and forth between this, but ultimately, actually, the exclusion or the official exclusion of some of these industrial fishing operations from the lake was tied to an election. And so I think it was the early 2000s, I can't remember if it was actually 2000 or slightly thereafter, but there was an election promise made to return the fisheries to communities, essentially, and provide them with the governance of these fisheries. And so I think you can see from the last example, certainly that, that does not seem to be fully true, but there was this point in time when a lot of the fishing concessions that had been made in the lake were eliminated and communities were granted control of these resources. And so that has fostered, that sort of underpinned then these community fish refuges implementation and the ability for the government to say, and now you have a refuge here that we're going to also provide some support to protect. And these communities that have been managing their fisheries for some time have had control of that. And so the communes that are set up for this sort of local management function do have some control of budget. And so one of the big goals actually of the Community Fish Refuge project was to get the community fish refuges as an agenda item within the commune structure so that people were investing in them locally too in various ways for their management. So great question, absolutely very much intertwined with this really complex and rich history that underpins a lot of things in Cambodia for sure. Yeah.
I guess we can move to a question in the chat from Eric White. The question is, what types of larger political, economic, or social interventions at either the local or regional level are necessary in order to enable community fish refuges succeed better in the future?
Okay, that's a very big question. I mean, I think that in some ways the strength of the community fish refuges is that they're routed in the community and that they are a strategy sort of in spite of those bigger forces. And so I think that is sort of the niche that they're trying to occupy and having some success in, which is not to say that those bigger forces are certainly not shaping them in ways that are going to really challenge their effectiveness. But I think that it's really complex to decide, for the Cambodian government and others, how do you want to think about your fish populations going forward? What do you want to prioritize? There's at least in the fisheries world, there's a Cambodian minister who sort of famously said, we will be in a good situation when the children of Cambodia can go look at these fish in a museum, we want to develop and we're going to do what it takes to do that. And that might mean changing fishing in this scenario, right? So that's obviously an extreme view on one side of things, but there's certainly a balance that they're really actively thinking about. I think that the challenge a lot of times is that not everyone can be in that throes of development at the same time, right? So you still have people really dependent on these fisheries. Oftentimes they're going to be the most vulnerable for the longest stretch of time, right? So I think in a way that these community fish refuges are trying to provide that support. And I think one of the challenges that we sort of uncovered in the Photovoice project is they're supporting these communities in the rice field fisheries that are doing relatively better compared to the folks who are really on the lake shore and struggling with fish catch there. So it's not necessarily capturing oftentimes there are folks who have rice fields, right? It's not capturing people who are landless and a whole host of other folks that may be really vulnerable in these systems.
This brought me back to the time I visited film myself and how interesting and sort of felt so delicately perched. Everything was sort of integrated. It felt like a real system that I was observing for this city. And it's so neat to see the way that you could 4 different parts of how that works together. I'm interested in the other big sort of human directed change to the system, which I guess is the damming of the Mekong higher up. And I wonder if any of what you've shown us here could be interpreted through a lens of, or help us to interpret like the likely consequences of the reduced water flow or different seasonality therein having to do with these dams that are coming from higher up.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So the question about the really big change that's afoot in this region and the damming of the Mekong that will change water flows really dramatically, and what the findings here might suggest about that other big change that's very much in motion. So I think some of the perspectives that we use here in trying to tie both, sure, there'll be this big change in water and people are going to respond in a whole bunch of different ways to it. And thinking about those really in tandem is going to give you a better understanding of the consequences, sort of in the biggest picture sense, suggest something. But I think more broadly that the dynamics of these changes that people are facing and sort of how they then go about navigating them is, whatever the environmental driver, I think it might be reasonable to expect similar challenges for the people that are in the system. And so one of the tricky things about the system is actually the diversity of it. So from the ecological standpoint, there are a ton of fish species, and we know a lot of things about them in terms of how they move. And so, you have fish that part of their life history involves them migrating up and down the Mekong, involves their eggs flowing up and down the Mekong to sort of underscore the productivity. And it's really hard to say what will happen if those things stop, right? So the flood pulse and Cambodia's ecosystems are really intimately intertwined. And if you disrupt that, it's very hard to say, what is going to be the impact on fish productivity, on fish populations. There are sort of hopeful scenarios where, like, okay, these fish won't be as big a part of the system, but these ones will. But again, we don't really know what will come to fruition. And so there have been some projections trying to look at how the damming might affect people's access to different types of fish and livelihoods and nutrition. And as you can probably imagine, they don't show very optimistic outcomes.
So we have another question on Zoom. Roughly speaking, what is the combined area of the refuges compared to the average area of the lake or floodplain or some other measure of the area?
Oh, okay. Okay, so the question about the area of the refuges versus the floodplain and the lake. So I guess vanishingly small. The lake is enormous compared to these refuges. The floodplain is enormous compared to the refuges. So they're pretty small at the root of it, and so I think the idea is really that the network of them is ultimately going to be quite important. And so the ones I looked at here, this was 40 of them. The next phase of this project that World Fish did scaled to 500. So this is the subset that I looked at here is also very small of what was both implemented by the government and now sort of getting this larger support structure too.
There's a old saying in Cambodia, wherever there's fish or wherever there's water, there's fish. Right, it's sort of a metaphor for where there's smoke, there's fire. It's used that way. But whenever I go back, family, there's a sense that doesn't mean families from Jet back it out, and they're right on the bank of the Mekong. There's a sense that the fish are disappearing, and that saying is not true anymore. Huh. My question is that in your research and in your travels, does the same kind of sense make its way up that you have contact with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question, hearkening to a saying of where there's water, there's fish, and a sense that folks in a community adjacent to the Mekong River have that is becoming less and less true. And whether that sentiment sort of is coming up in these communities that are closer to the Tonle Sap or in the rice field fisheries. So that's a great question. You know, I would love to hear more about those communities too, because I think there sort of has been this distinction of like folks who are on the Mekong are facing pretty different set of challenges to people who are really adjacent to the Tonle Sap and who are in the rice field fisheries. And I don't really know how in parallel those experiences are. I think, you know, some of the big picture drivers are probably quite similar, but I think some of the specifics might be really different. But I think from what people shared in the Photovoice, I didn't hear that specific sentiment, but I think generally, yes, that like fish catch is declining for them, and it's really a challenge that they can't count on the lake in the way that they used to be able to. I think maybe similarly in the rice field fisheries, but it's less like of primary importance to them in a way that they're sort of like, we've shifted over here, and this is the response. And so maybe in some ways it has like come in, they're already past that too. So I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, but it sounds in some ways like the sentiment might be more similar to what we were hearing from the communities right along the Tonle Sap too.
So we have another question on Zoom. Does aquaculture have any impact on wild capture fisheries in the communities that you've studied? If so, who is involved in fish farming, small producers or commercial operators, and what kinds of environmental or social impacts is it having?
Okay, that's a great question. So about the dynamics of aquaculture. So this is a pretty interesting system to think about aquaculture in, because there's sort of this continuum of production, like what makes it aquaculture as opposed to wild fishing, right? We're already in a very human modified habitat, right? Rice fields aren't a pond. In some of these cases, the fish refuges are being stocked. So like that's the kind of practice that you would also see in aquaculture. So one way we talk about it is sort of this continuum of production. And I think we really see households practicing that in a whole bunch of different ways. So one of the other really interesting strategies are these sort of trap ponds that people will sort of dig out a pond so that the fish will come into it when they're migrating around, and as the water recedes, they'll remain in there, and then they just harvest them all. And so that's also sort of like somewhere in the middle, like it's a little bit like a more aquacultural practice, but it's using wild fish. Right, so there's some fuzziness in that, but people are more and more sort of practicing a bit of aquaculture integrated into these systems too, and having like what you would think of as sort of more of a traditional aquaculture pond at a homestead level. The industrial aquaculture practice is growing by leaps and bounds everywhere globally, and especially in Southeast Asia, and so that also is a dynamic. It wasn't necessarily like as visible in these particular communities, but it underpins a lot of what's going to go on with fish production broadly. So right now, about half of global fish production comes from aquaculture. The large majority of that is actually in China. And so a lot of other regions and Southeast Asia and South Asia coming up very, very quickly in this space are producing more and more fish by aquaculture as well. So it's certainly going to be something also that really continues to change the landscape of the value chains of the different ecosystems that people have access to. I think the sort of hope of aquaculture is often that, oh, this will be so great for all the small scale fishers of the world, which are a large population of people globally. But I think the reality is that it's capital intensive. It requires quite a bit of expertise to do. You really need the high quality fingerlings and feed to make it go well. So who actually will be able to gain entry into these aquaculture systems, I think is far less clear.
First, thanks so much for this talk. I'm happy that you addressed the trap on the that was the first one. I've been called on, so the second. So I was thinking about having observed like really small scale fishing in farms in Cambodia, Isan, and in southern Laos, roughly during some time period. And how one of the phenomena that I observed was people using like lights to attract bugs, right? So that the fish are feeding this at night. So how would you compare, and you sort of mentioned this a little bit, but could you specify it? How would you describe and compare how feed is being introduced for the fish in these refuge sites to other sites that you described? This is industrial models for the foods.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, and I mean, I think like some of these practices, and so let me repeat it for Zoom actually. So the question was about observations of folks using lights to recruit bugs that would provide food for fish in some of these settings. And so thinking about, this continuum of strategies that people might be using in different production scenarios and sort of how what people are doing in the refuges, the community fish refuges, might compare. So I don't know that people were feeding in the community fish refuges, but they were really carefully monitoring like the fish community essentially. And so there was some fertilization of ponds to create more plankton, for example. So that's sort of the base of the food web. And so trying to generate some more algae and things that are going to feed these fish species. But I don't know that there was fish feed actually being put into them at any point. But there may well have been sort of some of these more subtle strategies like lighting used to recruit bugs for the fish and whatnot. Just to mention actually, like I think the aquaculture feed arena is a real site of innovation and insects of all types being really tried to provide high quality feed that won't require harvesting fish to then transform into feed. So I think it's certainly an interesting arena.
I think that's the last question that we have. He's going to make an announcement. Sorry. I think it was just about Gatty Rewind and reminding everyone. Yes, okay, I guess I can try. Okay, let me do the announcement.
Okay.
So thank you, Professor Fiorella, for your informative talk. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to her. We have two announcements. So this week, the Gatty Rewind podcast has May Sabep-Pugh from the Gender Equality Network in Myanmar to discuss her advocacy for women in Myanmar, specifically with regards to the ongoing conflict. Towards the middle of the episode, she shares some helpful resources for people in the US to get involved. The podcast is available on SoundCloud, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please join us next Thursday, April 28th, as we welcome Abigail DeKosnik from UC Berkeley for her talk on piracy, the Philippines and America, entitled The Many Piracies of Brides of Sulu. So until then, thank you so much for joining.